Welcome to GAF Lockdown, our regular show where we educate ourselves for the struggle to come. Today, we are going to be talking about a world without prisons, an introduction to prison abolition following a legacy of Black feminist and queer analysis and struggle. You can join us for a workshop to discuss the realities of the prison system in the UK and why prison abolition is a necessary part of anti-racist, feminist, and queer justice. Together, we will work to envision a world with safe, resilient communities equipped with the tools to respond to harm and support survivors without the use of punishment, surveillance, and cages. But first, let me remind you what is GAF and how you can get involved. The Green Anti-Capitalist Front is an alliance of groups and individuals united by a belief that capitalism is one of the core causes of the environmental crisis threatening us all, and that if we don't act, the cause of that crisis will fall on the poor and powerless. If you want to get involved, you can contact one of our existing groups, which you can find in places like London, Birmingham, Glasgow, and Edinburgh, among others. All the contact info is in our website, greenanticapitalist.org. But also remember that GAF is a front, and as such, as long as you agree with our aims and principles, you can create your own collective or take action under the GAF banner without having to ask for permission. Finally, something I like to do every live stream from now on is to give a shout out to different struggles happening around the world and locally that you can support. To begin with, in the last live stream, we talked about the ongoing hunger strike by several Mapuche political prisoners to demand their freedom from the Chilean state that has incarcerated them and kept them in terrible conditions that are putting their health at risk. Today, we have a new and sad development. On the 2nd of August, while several Mapuche people were occupying a government building to demand the release of the Machi Celestino Cordova and all the Mapuche political prisoners imprisoned by the state, a group of 200 fascists armed with sticks and other kinds of weapons attacked them, setting fire to the building and to their cars and beating them up. The attack seems to have been organized by a local far-right political organization called APRA and with the coercion, premeditated or not, of the police and very likely the state, who even went as far as to hand some of the arrested Mapuche people back to the mob to be attacked. In response, protests in support of the Mapuche people have started all over Chile and still continue, and new occupations are taking place. Despite the attacks of the Chilean state and the racists, the Mapuche people continue fighting. Given how recent all of this is, we can provide many sources in English about the ongoing situation, but we encourage everyone to learn more about the struggle of the Mapuche people and to take action in support of their fight. Solidarity with the Mapuche people, Marchihueo. Continuing this, something that is very close to our heart, an squatter social space in Berlin. Squatter social spaces in Berlin are being repressed by the state. This started with a police attack of the syndicate community-run bar, which was bravely resisted and has continued with a wave of evictions. This is part of the state's plan to gentrify the whole city and get rid of any space that is not profitable. It's for these reasons that the state and the cops, with their court orders, cold evictions, and repressive operations, have carried out dozens of evictions and are planning many more. Sabot Garden, G17A, GHHAs, Tepic Fabric, and Draghi are only a few examples of places that have already been evicted. Others, like the bar collective Meute and Syndicate, the youth group Posse, and the anarcha-queer feminist project L34 are facing their upcoming evictions. On August 7th, there is a planned eviction of the Syndicate, which will be carried out by a London-based company called Pierce Global. This highlights the need for international unity on a struggle for housing and community spaces. As such, comrades from Berlin have requested for the news to be spread and for actions of solidarity to be carried out, no matter how big or small. GAF stands in solidarity with their fight and echoes their call. Against the state and the bosses, against anyone who has an interest in maintaining inequality and injustice. Solidarity with L34, Posse, Syndicate, Meute. Solidarity with all those subjected to repression. Freedom for everybody. In order for us to stand, they have to fail. Following this, we have also been requested to talk about the ongoing situation in Zimbabwe. where the government has been arresting political dissenters and members of the opposition since an anti-government protest was violently disbanded last week by the police and army, ignoring their legal rights to protest. Using the excuse of COVID-19, the government of President Emerson Mnangagwa has arrested more than 60 people so far, and several investigative journalists are on trial or in hiding. There is allegations of violence against arrested protesters and even murder of political dissenters. These kind of injustices have plagued the government of Mnangagwa since the beginning, despite its promises of democratizing the country after the fall of the previous dictatorship. And with the massive inflation in the country forcing people to even more desperate situations, things may only escalate from here. We can provide a way to help with the situation for now, but we suggest people check the hashtag Zimbabwean Lives Matters for updates. We would also like to share our support with the collective Stop Burzdurom. They are a radical feminist queer collective based in Polish capital Warsaw. They are on the forefront of the fight for queer rights in Poland, a country which took a sharp turn towards anti-LGBTQ+ sentiments. The collective is known for organizing a number of direct actions in the fight for queer rights and are now facing repression, persecution, and possible prison sentences. That's why they have organized a fundraiser to pay for the legal fees and continue fighting for the rights of queer people in Poland. GAF stands in solidarity with all queer people around the world, and especially those suffering state repression. We encourage you to donate to the fund and to take action in support of Stop Burzdurom against the far-right government of Andrzej Duda. Finally, for those living in London or in close proximity, this Saturday, 8th of August, there'll be a demo outside the Tottenham police station to protest against the racism, violence, and impunity of the police. This will be only after a few days after the anniversary of the killing of Mark Dugan by police in Tottenham. At GAF, we support the cause of Black people to achieve full liberation and autonomy, and we understand that the fight against the state and capital that are destroying the world is inextricably linked to the fight against white supremacy, colonialism, and the police and prison systems used to perpetuate them all. Until every prison becomes a library, until the police is abolished, we will keep fighting. See you in the streets. And finally, if you are involved or know about an ongoing struggle, campaign, or initiative of the anti-capitalist and autonomous variety that needs some attention, let us know and we'll give it a shout on our live stream. You can email us on Green Anti-Capitalist Front at riseup.net to let us know. And for people wondering, I will provide links to all of this both on the chat of the live stream when I have an opportunity and on the recording of the video once it goes up. With that out of the way, I'm gonna stop speaking now. I've spoken like way too much already and I'm tired. So I'm going to let our guest today kind of take over and guide us through the workshop. So Kel, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm Kelsey. I'm from Cradle Community and Community Action on Prison Expansion, CAPE. I'm also here with my comrade TJ. If you want to say hi, TJ.
Hello, I'm TJ, they, them pronouns, also Community Action on Prison Expansion, and you may also know me through Activist Legal Support Network stuff.
Yeah, and thank you so much to GAF for having us. I'm a little bit low energy today, so apologies for that, but I'm really happy to be here, and I'm gonna hopefully this session is going to be quite participatory for the people on this call. So I'm hoping, because I feel like lots of you will already have like quite a lot of knowledge, quite a lot of thoughts and questions, and so I want to make use of this space for all of that. Like I said, my name is Kelsey. I am a prison abolitionist organizer, and I'm involved in some transformative justice work. And I kind of before we start, I want to hold up the people that I've learned basically everything that I'm going to talk about today. I'm gonna I need to, you know, honor the people and evoke the names of certain people and groups who've been doing this work for years, decades, some of them. As was mentioned in the intro, we follow a legacy of Black feminists and queer analysis, and so it's important to acknowledge some of those people. Also, just in case there's any groups that you haven't heard of, definitely recommend looking up any of these folks. So obviously, Angela Davis, Mariam Kaba with Survived and Punished, Critical Resistance, and Ruthie Wilson Gilmore. But all of the people working with critical resistance since the 90s and up till now as well. A lot of great organizers doing important work. And I want to also be sure to mention Beth Ritchie and people who've been doing this work to speak about domestic violence and prison abolition. Also in the UK, people like Avia Sarah Day and Lola Olufemi. Sisters Uncut are groups that, yeah, I've learned a lot from and could not claim any of this knowledge without the learning that I've had from those people. So yeah, the sort of aim with this session is I'm gonna it's an intro to prison abolition and this idea of this world without prisons. So first gonna kind of demystify and work with you all to think about the reality of the prison system as it is now, sort of in the UK, but also wider than that. And because, as you'll see, prison abolition is what I'm seeing as like a strategy within the anti-imperialist struggle, within the anti-capitalist struggle, and it's important to take an anti-imperialist view with it. We're going to be talking about the kind of realities of that system, and then what we're going to do is talk about, because I think this is what always comes up as soon as we talk about prison abolition, is we want to talk about what do we think of what we're going to do instead. You know, what are the alternatives? What does this world without prisons actually look like? So we're going to work together to think through some scenarios and really think about what we can do, because the reality is with prison abolition is that it means that it's down to us. It's not going to be about outsourcing all of our issues to an institution or a system or an NGO. And so we really are going to have to, as lots of us already do, start thinking about how we respond to issues without the use of prisons and police. So hopefully that sounds all right. Yeah, I'm going to kind of dive in. So I just really think it's important to ground the session in thinking about the history. And I'm personally not a historian. And actually, if we are to really look for an honest account of the history of prisons, it's actually can be fairly difficult to access. I'm also not an academic, and I have limited access to academic research and all of that. But there's also, funnily, not that much about prisons in the global South and Britain's sort of role in it. But from what we do know, I think that a lot of us have, or it's quite easy to access information about the history of prisons and police in the US. There's quite a good film called The 13th on Netflix, where you can, find out a lot of information about the history from colonization to slavery to the current prison industrial complex in the US. And I think in the UK, there's often a tendency to kind of be like, well, at least we're not America, to not, to think that maybe that's an issue more over there than it is here. But I'm sure lots of the people on the call are aware that that is not the case. So Britain, actually, if we think about the history of policing, we know that kind of the first iterations of police force, they kind of started in Ireland, but quite quickly that model was used in the colonies. And so while in the US, we might see quite a clear lineage of slavery and policing and the building of prisons exactly on that land, you know, across the South particularly. But here they kind of avoid it because it was happening in the colonies. And because it's not happening in the same way on the mainland till much later, that responsibility is kind of avoided. So when we actually look at former colonies, particularly the Caribbean, we know that places like Jamaica, Guyana, Barbados, yeah, the islands in the Caribbean, we know that during slavery, people were being forcibly moved to the Caribbean, and there were people from Britain who were given jobs to become police over in the colonies. And it's just important to recognize that because also that wasn't even seen necessarily, for some people that was seen as like an honor for them to be able to, you know, if they were part of the colonizing class, but it was also used as a punishment to be sort of banished to the colonies from the mainland. And they would often in itself use the having to go to the colonies as a punishment, and working class people, very poor people, would maybe be given a sentence of 7 years in the Caribbean, but actually you know, would be too poor to be able to afford to ever come back. And so there's definitely as kind of an interesting class element that was happening there. But what we see obviously is that in order to create a class system in the Caribbean and in other colonies, the fact that they were still white is obviously what won out. And so they could gain class and power and all these kinds of things out there. And people of color, Black and brown people who were moved from Africa, but then later as slavery was abolished as indentured servants, people from India, Southeast Asia, and also China were moved over to the Caribbean as well. And so they were also policed in the same way. In fact, as slavery was abolished, it just means that they had to find more ways to force people into labor. So whether that was through indentureship, whether that was through punishment, and whether that was through just finding loopholes to subjugate people, and basically by creating race, right? So we see that history quite clearly if we start to actually look at the colonies. And if we actually look at sorry, I told you I'm a little bit all over the place today. But what's important, I think, to acknowledge or to recognize is that that history continues. And really, when we look at abolition, and why I think it's so important to look at the history is because we're not just thinking about abolition as a movement that started in the 70s as part of the 60s and the 70s as part of the Black liberation movement, but actually as part of the ongoing resistance that has always been there against slavery, against colonization, and against white supremacy, and against racial capitalism. And if we really look at what racial capitalism means, then what we see is that ever since slavery, they've just been finding new ways to exploit, control, and surveil Black and brown people, and in order to maintain white supremacy. And they've just found more and more ways to do that. And so the new machinery of slavery is just that it became indentured servitude, and then it's become prisons. And when we look at the history of prisons in the UK, we actually see that the prison population and the amount of prisons that we had starts to increase massively about halfway through the 1900s, which is the same time as Windrush was happening. And so at the same time as we start to see more migration from the Caribbean, from countries in the global South, we start to see an increase in imprisonment and incarceration in the UK. And when I'm talking about imprisonment, I'm not just talking about prisons. I mean detention centers and all kinds of detention. So that includes mental health detention as well. And also, forced, ways that they imprison children that they don't call prisons and such. So yeah, we start to see that history very evidently, or we start to see the agenda very evidently if we actually start to look at this in an anti-imperialist perspective, and we see that as the colonies begin to gain independence, particularly in the 60s and 70s in the Caribbean, we know that that's the same time that lots of people are obviously emigrating over to the UK. We see an increase in the prison population, but we also see an increase in policing on the streets, in all kinds of new kinds of laws that start to really enforce certain behaviors. And that's when we start to see things like the war on drugs, which obviously has increased and driven incarceration in the UK, in the US, but also abroad. And if we're looking at, for example, ways that colonization is still very alive, and where I would say that this racial capitalism kind of enacts punishment through economics and through controlling these countries on a global scale. So even though somewhere like Guyana gained independence from the British in the 60s, they've never been free because the US and the UK can sanction them, can control their economy, have created it so that other islands like Barbados, Jamaica, they rely so much on tourism that you're not even able to sell the food that you grow on those lands to the people that live there. You have to export everything and you have to import everything else. That's the same in lots of countries in Africa, in Zimbabwe, where people are forced to farm massive amounts of food that is not for the people who live there while people starve. Like it really is this way that economics and trade is used to punish and to control these countries and maintain this status quo. So despite becoming independent, despite having your own governments, white supremacy is maintained. So that's like just a very quick sort of rundown. I guess another thing I wanted to mention in terms of how active the global north is in incarceration in the global south is, or how kind of not transparent they are about these things, is that I believe that the first prison in Jamaica was built by the British, but it's quite difficult. There's only sort of like one or two places where that is written down as anything, because mostly it's avoided. Mostly it just says things like it was built to house enslaved people, and so without saying who they're enslaved by, right? And so these kinds of ways that it's very much avoided, and so that's in the 1800s, or I think beginning of the 1900s, that they built that prison. And yet, still in 2011, I think David Cameron offered to, in the shape of, under the name of like aid and like money gifted to Jamaica, supposedly, they offered to build them a prison, which was, going to act as a place for people to be deported from the UK straight into prison in Jamaica. And so this like prisons across borders in a very literal way. That prison has been rejected. They wanted to do the same thing in Nigeria, and that prison has also been rejected. But there are ways that I guess, like, as we develop like new ways of policing and surveillance in the global north, those things are used. Like lots of our policing technology comes from the military, so obviously it was created and developed in order to for war and for military purposes, and are then like used in the UK and in the US and across Europe, but also, sorry, what am I trying to say? Not sure, but just that it's important to acknowledge like that all of these technologies are connected, and that these strategies are used across borders. And when we talk about policing, I think we need to acknowledge like where a lot of that has come from. I'm going to kind of move on from this because you've heard me talk about history a bit too much now. it's just hopefully enough to kind of encourage you all to look into more about Britain's role in these things. Oh yeah, I know what it was. It's just about the technologies and the strategies that we use. So in a lot of places in the global south, prisons also look very different. It's more about having like bigger cells with lots of people in. For example, like solitary confinement is much less likely to be used in a lot of places in South America, particularly and Latin America. But the US like gives money to countries like Uruguay to increase their capacity for solitary confinement and to develop like more ways of like torturing people and basically making incarceration even more violent. And so developing those technologies like for the global south and incentivizing them to use them for issues when we know that primarily like a lot of the people in South America particularly are in those prisons for drug-related crimes and to do with like the cocaine and marijuana trade. So that's an issue that was created by the global north. And anyway, I'm going to stop talking before my head explodes. So I have a question now to kind of ground us more in kind of the reality of what prisons are doing now. I'm trying to, if we're talking about prison abolition, we have to kind of think about what are we being told about this system and why isn't everyone already a prison abolitionist, you know? So what is it that we believe that prisons are supposed to do? What is it that we want from that system? What we told that they might be doing already? If we were to look at the media, what would we be told that they were doing? Happy to, if people are able to raise their hands or if they want to write in the chat.
Yeah, so if people click on their own icon, they should have the option to raise their hand, or if not, just write in the chat that you want to speak, and then you can just unmute yourself.
About what is it that people want from a prison system? What are we told prisons are doing? See a couple people typing.
Michelangelo has a hand.
Oh, yes. Would you like to unmute yourself, Michelangelo?
Hello, yes. So one of the things that prisons supposedly do is rehabilitate offenders. Highly questionable, of course.
Right, exactly. That's one of the big things, right? We have the rehabilitation aspect, keeping criminals off the streets, right? So this is like the public safety narrative, right? It's about there's these criminals, they need to be controlled. There's people who need to be rehabilitated. What else have we got? A lot of the responses I've got before seem to have to do with protecting victims of violence. But when you ask victims or survivors, many of us will say we received nothing from the police or the courts. They keep us safe. Exactly. So there's a lot of these kinds of narratives about public safety. There's definitely something that's particularly here has been really pushed around policing and domestic violence, or sort of women, quote unquote, women's safety, which, as we've seen, like the domestic violence rate has not changed. Most people don't report all of these kinds of things that we can get into more later. Revenge or retribution, absolutely, that there's like a, you know, punishment is definitely an aim, right? That there's someone deserves punishment, they have to do the time if they've done the crime. Anyone else? Oh, is there another hand there? And so how would you respond? Any feelings on this? Let's think about rehabilitation, or let's think about the keeping us safe. What does that mean? why do we feel like that might not be true? If you want to put your hand up or unmute yourself and speak.
Evan, would you like to? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't hear Evan. Yeah, remember to unmute yourself. We also have a hand from Emily if you want to speak first.
Emily, yes, go for it.
Can everyone hear me? I haven't used this platform before, so I'm not sure. Evan, you can go first if you want to. Oh, okay, sure. I think a binary is created where the people inside are considered them, and then it's us. So we're not safe, but not including the people inside as part of us. And obviously, people inside are the complete opposite of safe. They're being traumatized and abused. Yeah, that's all.
Totally. It creates that binary when it's not like, yeah, you know, we actually know that most people are in prison for a relatively short amount of time. And that, I guess it comes to what our understanding of what crime is, right? Thank you, Emily. Evan, you ready?
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I was gonna say a similar thing, just in terms of like, yeah, who they're meant to be keeping safe, and also to question whether they do, whether current like carceral responses to crime do actually reduce crime or make society safer, both for the people inside prisons and for people not inside prisons.
Yeah, great questions. You know, like what really keeps us safe, and what are we being kept safe from, and who are we? What is safety? What is crime? All socially constructed to maintain heteronormative, ableist, sexist, racist, transphobic, sexist order. That's from Hirsch. The conviction rate for sexual violence is really, really low. Yeah, all of these responses are really great. I think, yeah, there's clearly like some great understanding of the reality of what the prison system is doing. If we actually look at who is in the prison system in the UK, we know that it's majority working class people. The majority of people who are in prison are in for crimes of survival, things like theft, handling of stolen goods, fraud, sex working offences, drug-related offences. These kinds of things are making up the majority of sort of crime that's being convicted in the UK, right? That's not necessarily the most amount of crime that's happening. But then, yeah, we're going to get more into this idea of what crime is in a second. But we also know that, so I came into this work through, from a domestic violence and sexual violence perspective. I came to this work through thinking about feminism and realizing that the people who are most vulnerable to violence in their lives are also the most vulnerable to violence from the state, right? And how can you go to that system if you're being marginalized and persecuted and violated by it? And so we know that it's a lot of the same people who are going through domestic violence services as who are going through the prison system. We know that if we look at the women's prison system, that the people in women's prisons are majority of them have been abused either as children or as adults. Many of them have been through the care system. for the prison population generally. A huge amount of people who have been through the care system have been excluded from school, have been experienced poverty, as well as learning difficulties and all these kinds of things. That's not to say that there aren't also people who are violent who are in prison, but it's more to say that actually that's less to do with whether you're going to go to prison or not. We actually know that the majority of rapists are not going to go to prison, right? And so who is it that's actually in there? It's people who are vulnerable to being incarcerated. We'll have to think about some more. Does anyone else have any other? So in terms of the actual like makeup of our prison system as well, we know that it's hugely racist, and in the UK, Black and POC people make up only about 10% of the overall population in the UK, but make up 25% of the prison population. We know that from every step throughout the criminal justice process, that institutional racism increases your chances of getting a worse result. So as a young Black person, they are more likely to be stopped and searched in the first place. They're more likely to be arrested, then more likely to go to a trial, then more likely to be convicted, and more likely to be to serve a custodial sentence, and more likely for that sentence to be longer. And so all the way through, these things compound. And when we know that also in the UK, Black Caribbean children are being excluded at 3 times, that's permanently excluded from school, at 3 times the rate of white children. We know that this is a system that excludes people like very, very early on, and being excluded from school increases your chances of being criminalized massively. Having a parent who has been criminalized increases your chances of being in prison massively. Going through the foster care system increases your chances of going to prison massively. And so what we see over and over again is that actually, like, it's not that you're more likely to cause harm, it's more likely that you are going to be someone who is the kind of person who could go to prison. And what I say is that, you know, why someone goes to prison is much more to do with who they are than what they've done. We actually need to think about crime and harm, right? And as it's kind of been pointed out, is crime is not the same as something that's harmful. The majority of things that people are prosecuted for are not things that are actually harmful to anything other than the capitalist system, right? It's about theft, it's about property, but actual interpersonal harm is the stuff that people don't actually go to prison for, because most abuse and violence is able to sort of happen because of power dynamics, and those power dynamics are mirrored in the government system and within the prison system. Anyone have any sort of questions or anything they want to add on that? I guess like my question really is like, what do you think is the difference between like crime and harm? TJ, also, if you want to add anything.
Sure. GAF person has a hand up.
Yes, go for it.
Yeah, that's me. I'm raising my hand, so there's no like, you know, privileges to talk. But yeah, I think like the difference between crime and harm is that crime is a construct created by the state and the authority to outline what they believe to be harmful to them, to be inconvenient to them, to be unprofitable to them, to get in their way. And but what is actually harmful to like people, to all of us, is very different, and sometimes can interact, but very often doesn't. So really, what is harm, what is defined as crime, has very little to do what is actually harmful. It has all to do what what is the interest of the ruling class, what is the interest of the state and the corporations.
Yeah, thank you. Crime doesn't exist. Just looking at the comments as well, crime doesn't exist. It is defined by state, and harm is enabled by the same state. Exactly. So if we really like think about all of the laws that there are, and if they were to actually try and prosecute every single time everyone broke any laws, the courts would be completely overrun, and like it would just be impossible with the amount of like sexual violence that's happening, the amount of just like theft and everything that people are doing all the time, right? But so what they do is they choose who to apply the laws to in order to maintain the status quo. And so in order to maintain a working class, in order to maintain white supremacy, they can highly criminalize certain communities. And they can create laws that criminalize those people, and they can also enforce laws just by picking and choosing who it is. And we see that all the time with it's not that posh white kids are not doing drugs, but they're just not going to prison for it. And there's a lot of posh white kids walking around with class A's and all kinds of things in their pockets that are never going to get stopped and searched. Just on one basic level. So I think that what we touched on there as well is like the harm that's caused by the state, right? If we're actually looking at harm, then we know that harm is not just interpersonal, it's by your circumstances, and that your choices are informed by your circumstances and who the world is telling you that you are. So if you are, your experience as someone with a lot of class and racial privilege is going to be very different from someone who does not have that. I think if we actually look at the biggest harms that are happening in our society, and we really look at what we call state violence, what we think about is things like Grenfell, right? Is looking at like, where's the accountability for that? Where's the punishment or anything? Like, there's never going to be accountability for something like that because it's harm that's done by the state. Can anyone think of what else we mean when we talk about state violence then? Environmental harm, I mean the climate crisis is state violence, right? We also know that is like very material consequences, particularly for people in the global south, people who are losing land, who are losing their health, their water supplies. When we really think about state violence, definitely thinking about Indigenous struggles as well, and the active occupation of Indigenous lands and the destruction of Indigenous life. State violence, the system of exploitation that is capitalism. So kind of what I was saying at the beginning as well, in terms of the ways that capitalism is maintained by exploitation in the global south, right? And also, state violence via education and schooling. So, Haj, do you want to say a little bit more about that?
feel free to unmute yourself if you want. I can say a little if you're feeling hesitant or don't want to speak for whatever reason. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
Sorry, can you hear?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
We can now. Yeah.
Sorry, that took a bit to start. Yeah, I work in education policy, and I'm currently researching the school to police, the school to prison pipeline, and a lot of so the inclusion rates are increasing. Behavior policies are increasingly becoming more and more violent, especially towards kids with SEN, low socioeconomic backgrounds that looked after children, particularly Black and boys and girls and gender non-conforming pupils. And so with the increase of these policies, and I think there's a new school that's opening up, which is basically a prison. And it's all, that they're going to really care for these kids and they're going to give them therapeutic services and help them. But it's really, that's not the case. You're socially excluding children. And I think about 60% of those who are incarcerated in UK prisons right now have been excluded either permanently or through fixed term exclusions during their very short school careers. So it's talked about a lot in the American context, the school to prison pipeline, but it's not heavily addressed in the UK because there are so many different initiatives and schools and alternative provisions and academizations that are going on, but it's all a massive farce really, because they're still, socially excluding the most vulnerable kids. So yeah, I think that's another form of state violence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, in the UK, they've developed so many new different names and types of alternative schools, and the PRUs, the PRU units, and these secure schools that they're now trying to develop that are children's prisons, but are kind of a partnership between the Ministry of Justice and the Department for Education, and all these things that really then don't and shout out to No More Exclusions, which is an excellent group doing great work. It's really it's so important to question just the concept of even removing people from the mainstream education system, and what that in itself does, and what exclusion itself does to a child, and the way that that in itself is violent and has huge implications for their life. And similarly, I've recently been learning more about the foster care to prison pipeline, and here also a huge amount of people who've been in the foster care system also end up in prison. And it's all about social services role and these institutions that we deem to be friendly, right? And deemed to be these social services, these things that are supposed to be for the people and aren't supposed to be punitive, but actually they act very punitively, and that these are actually huge punishments for families and for children, being separated, being isolated, and being stigmatized in huge ways. So yeah, it's I'm really glad that you brought that up. The violence of putting us in a state where we can't imagine an alternative. Exactly, totally. Just the way that the state has captured our imaginations. We speak about the prisons of the mind, and the ways that actually punishment and labeling people as good or bad, these things are so ingrained in our culture and within our psyches now that it's hard to even think of a world without these institutions that haven't even been around that long, Great. Other kind of things, TJ, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, there's loads of good comments about the sort of the violence, economic violence that people experience, whether that's through the sort of the gross inequality and the neglect, and when you were talking earlier about the trajectory of the prison system, when in the 70s, when the welfare state was taken away and we saw an increase in the prison population and the building of prisons there's definitely a correlation that matters. I think also what you touched on earlier about the history of colonialism and policing in prisons is that you know, what am I saying? So one huge element of state violence is wars and militarism, and so not just the wars that the UK is directly involved in West Asia, for example, but also the arms trade, which the UK is absolutely a key player in on the global scale. And they sell not just like weapons, but also surveillance equipment and technology, and all the sort of tools of repression to states around the world, used for policing and also for violence against suppressing internal suppressing internal populations, and also against in their own sort of colonialist or settler violence against other peoples. And when you look at the arms sales from the UK and where the majority of UK arms sales are licensed to, so all arms sales in the UK, even though it's private companies largely profiting from it, they have to be approved by UK, they have to have an arms export license, which is approved by the government, and which even under their own terms, a lot of them are should not be granted, even though they are. For example, arms sales to Israel, which is committing crimes of apartheid. But also, when you look at the where these arms are going from the UK, they're going to ex-colonies of the UK. They're going to India. They're going to Hong Kong. They're going to Israel. So there's that trajectory, as well as the sort of relationship with prisons and suppressing the internal population. I think, just like I always think of when we're talking about state violence and that massive amount of violence from all of that, the militarism, as well as the internal economic and physical violence that that people experience systemically. I always think of Angela Davis saying, well, when you what if you want to talk about violence, or how will we deal with violence without prisons? And she said, oh, you want to talk about violence? What about all of this violence, which is not being addressed? And I think that's been really inspirational for me.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you for the contribution. I think another, so there's like this really like broad and like international global level of state violence, and the way that states have this power on not just within their internal national state, but abroad, and Britain's role ongoingly in that. And also, and when we think of the internal stuff, I'd say one of the things that that's important to recognize when we're thinking about transformative justice and our work here is the state's responsibility in our daily lives as well. When we think about domestic violence and the ways that someone is trapped in a violent relationship because they don't have options for housing, like moving can just not be a financial option. There's no state supported housing. There's no services that are going to be safe to use. And I'd say that is also violence perpetrated by the state, that person is trapped by the state within that. And so you know, I also hugely think, like, what if we were to, you know, just have, if everyone just had enough housing, like what would happen to the crime rate now? Like, if everyone had adequate and safe housing, yeah, that would be one way to massively decrease the prison population. But yeah, so because I do want to get into these scenarios, I'm going to sort of, because we've touched a lot on already on sort of what about survivors and what about the ways that that system is already not serving people who experience domestic or sexual violence. We know the majority of people don't report. That is even more so when it comes to Black women and women of color, and trans and non-binary people, and queer people, and Indigenous communities. And we know that as well as disabled people and sex workers are also very unlikely to call the police. And it's actually through many of these kinds of groups, these communities, that this work actually originated. So often when people speak about abolition or they hear about abolition, and their first question is, well, what about survivors? As if that hasn't been thought of, as if this work has literally just been about, I don't know, don't even know what it would be about, but you know, sort of more surface level types of harm, I guess. But actually so much of this work is rooted in communities who have always had to find ways to support each other because they are dealing with interpersonal violence at the same time as also dealing with state violence. And so knowing that those systems are not there to support them, knowing that if you call the police, that is, as Mariam Kaba would say, you call the police and you throw a grenade, you know, that is going to make things so much worse, that there's always been a case of we need to find ways to support each other without this. And so, in fact, many of the Black feminists who have spoken about this work are people who were part of the Black liberation movement and found themselves still experiencing misogyny and sexual violence in those spaces where they were actively organizing against the police. And so this idea of transformative justice and community accountability, these frameworks were sort of developed out of that. And creative interventions is also another group that's really important to speak about. And they have like a 600-page toolkit for people to look at if you really want to get into like the ins and outs of accountability. But also, Insight and Critical Resistance and Survived and Punished have done a lot of work on this. And it's contrary to the fact that actually like violence against women or gender-based violence has been used as a driving factor for incarceration in recent years, and a driving factor for more laws that are around domestic and sexual violence. But we see that actually that violence is not happening at any less of an extent. And in fact, it in some ways just leads to more victim blaming because you haven't used those systems, right? And all this distraction, in my opinion, of having to now improve all of those systems, when actually we know that lots of reforms and all of these things have in some ways benefited white women or women with more financial and class and racial privilege, but have still not kept the most vulnerable communities safe, and also increased the amount of violence happening towards those communities because we're now having to go to prison. And we know also that there's plenty of, unfortunately, survivors themselves who are criminalized for defending themselves, for all kinds of reasons. And we don't need to get into that now, but it's a flawed system, basically. So when we start to think about ways that the expansion of the prison industrial complex we think about kind of these reforms, often they've been in the name of kind of quote unquote feminism or women's rights. We're seeing like more reforms to the types of incarceration that women experience, which is in a very sort of a paternalistic kind of way. A lot of stuff around mental health, a lot of stuff that doesn't actually really question the act of criminalization and the fact that gaining support and all of these things, accessing support, is still dependent on having been criminalized first, and has also led to like building up like more prisons for men often, because like also the prison system works on a gender binary and enforces the gender binary and doesn't allow for the nuances of understanding how violence really works between people. And so we have things like the domestic violence and abuse bill going through Parliament that is new legislation that is mostly about longer sentences for perpetrators and all these kinds of things, and not actually about healing, support, and preventing violence and actually uprooting the systems that create it. We also know that reforms that might actually kind of reduce, or not, well, it turns out they don't reduce the amount of people going to prison, but they increase the amount of sort of surveillance and such that happens on the streets. And the idea is that then supposedly more people won't go to prison, but they're building more prisons and increasing the amount of tools that they have to do community policing and tagging and all these kinds of things, which is mostly just profitable for private companies. So so those are some of the solutions that they offer, things like body cameras, community policing, like these things that are supposed to be for accountability, for increased safety on the streets, but we know like do nothing but increase the prison population basically and increase hostility towards Black and brown people, as well as like disabled people and trans and queer people. Bearing all that in mind, we're going to start getting into how are we going to start thinking about ways that we, I guess like how are some of the ways that we ourselves enforce punitive thinking in our daily lives, and how can we start to like dismantle these things within ourselves as well as within society. So some of the like core principles around transformative justice are just that. So it's around dismantling capitalism and the prison industrial complex, while also challenging those prisons that are in our hearts and minds. And in order to do that, in order to build the community support and the justice and the healing that we need to build resilience, accountability, wellness, I think we need to, I don't know, what else do we think that we want, and what else do we, what would we want out of an ideal system? I guess at the beginning of this, we talked about what does it say that system is doing. Maybe now it's time to talk about like, what do we really want? What would work? Any hands? Sort of principles that we want to bring into this work, because we'll go into more specific scenarios. Oh, Emily.
Like Mia Minga says, being able to deal with the small, like the level 2 harms before the bigger ones, and just getting better at engaging in conflict in a healthy way, including apologizing and vocalizing when we want things to be done differently. I really think interpersonal work is so key to abolishing the prison industrial complex, and can start super small. That wasn't super concrete, but
that's great. Like feeling more equipped to deal with these conflicts in our real lives, and in our interpersonally, and that being a huge part of how we start to dismantle this. And having that generative conflict and having the tools to do that. What else? Any other aspects? TJ, do you have your hand up?
Skills for intervening in situations of harm in an immediate sense, whether that's, so I'm talking about bystander intervention, and whether that is a situation where it's a police policing people, or whether that is a situation of violence, you know, of interpersonal violence in your community, and you know, how do you de-escalate or intervene in that without resorting to the state?
Yeah. Yeah, these kinds of tools for how to intervene, how to respond when someone's being harmed. Anyone else want to add? Training on running accountability processes. Yeah, and sort of what do we want out of accountability processes, I guess. Like, what does accountability look like? What do we not get out of a criminal justice system? Like, so we don't get often we're not gonna get them to really acknowledge that that someone's harmed us. That's often not something you get out of the criminal justice system, right? What else do we kind of want out of this system?
GAF person has a hand.
Yes, go for it.
Yeah. So another thing that I think should be part of you know, a new understanding of justice is looking at, you know, at this harm that is caused and understanding the roots of it and try to address it. So, you know, like in many cases, crimes come out of situations of poverty and exclusion, or of, you know, of being raised in a violent, sexist, white supremacist environment, and you know, I think like if we want to tackle all this harm that is happening, we need to like understand that we need to tackle all this, like you know, poverty, white supremacy, sexism, and all these things, and this will be integrated into like how we implement justice and how we go about like solving all these things, I think.
Yeah, totally. It's like getting into those root issues and like why harm is happening. Evan, I think you have a hand.
Can I say something?
You can go for it. Sure.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Kelsey. I just received the Cradle guide on how to.
Your name. I thought it might be. I'm glad that you.
Oh yeah.
Glad it
Have
arrived.
you been writing the envelopes? Yeah, so I think it's really brilliant. So it's full of like everyday scenarios and how testimonies of people who've intervened in or who've done something perhaps different from what you might expect, or who've, you know, actually stood up and maybe intervened in a situation where somebody else was being harmed. So I think those things are really, really valuable and really important. So we made with some friends a similar zine that's called Who You're Gonna Call, alternatives to calling the police. So it's similar in that it deals with scenarios and alternatives to where, you know, where in sort of normal mainstream thought you would call the police, and what else could you be doing instead of that? Because obviously, as we know, calling the police isn't going to resolve the issue, but make things worse oftentimes. So I think like one of the things that we wondered, and that I think I've personally participated in a bystander workshop, that being an active bystander. One of the things we did was doing like role play with scenarios. This was in my workplace, so it was like, imagine your colleague says something really racist. Like, what is a way that you could like respond to that? And we would talk. You know, we would literally do role plays. So I was wondering, because there seems to be real momentum for people. You know, there's events like this on abolition, like several times a week nowadays, even in the UK. And like, there's a real momentum, I think, for people to collaborate and get together and doing like practical skills workshops. I think that would be really valuable. And if you or others on the call would be up for like working on that, I'd be interested in talking about that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's sort of what Cradle and a couple other groups were doing before lockdown and before like the recent uprisings and stuff. And then it's still sort of we're transitioning, and during this time that there's all this new momentum, and it's a lot of intro stuff at the moment. And then hopefully we're going to move into doing more of the public, like solid skill stuff. But we're going to touch on that a little bit now. So I think, Evan, if you're able to make your point quite quickly, just because we're running out of time.
Yeah, I was just going to make a point about. Oh, it's slightly gone out of my head. It was something about like what we want from accountability, and thinking specifically around like accountability for those with a lot of wealth and power who perpetrate crime or harm or whatever, and if we can use accountability as a way of addressing those power imbalances to achieve a more like equitable or just society. That's I'd be interested to know more about if there is theory behind that.
Yeah, I think that's there's sort of a tendency often to kind of like focus on, I don't know, those are obviously like going to be like complicated because of the fact that we're already living in this time, but often we don't have accountability for just like the harms that are happening like interpersonally and with the state more generally, like with police, these kinds of things. And I think it's a bigger conversation that I would be really interested to have, but potentially not going to be able to get into it super well now. But thank you for raising it, because it's something I think about a lot. But I'm going to throw some scenarios at you, basically, to get us thinking. I guess like these are quite situations where the police sometimes might be called if you're not someone who questions that system, or they might be involved in some way because of that. But also like these are scenarios that many of us probably, or some of us will have experienced or know people who have. And there was sort of a safe spaces kind of policy towards the beginning, and I want us to be mindful of each other's experiences in this. But a situation that one might find themselves in is that if a friend is having has been experiencing a mental health crisis, and you've been worried that they might harm themselves, and you've gone around to their house or their flat, and you know that they haven't really been like going out much lately, and they're not answering their phone, and now they're not answering the door. So this is a scenario where we're thinking about how would we respond to this without the use of police and prisons, and what are the kind of desired outcomes in an ideal world, or like what do we kind of really want to try and be mindful of when we're thinking about something like this. as well. You have a hand? Oh no, wait, I think I'm gonna go with one of the others first. Emily, do you wanna go?
Depending on how well the person knew their neighbors, I would wonder about maybe seeing, like, checking with one of them if they've seen them go in and out, or if they've seen movement in the house at all. But that is very dependent. So I wouldn't, if the neighbors are sketch and would want to call the cops, then I don't know. Yeah.
Yep. So thinking about who else like might have information, or yeah, but like being mindful that they might not have good relationships with their neighbors, or kind of, yeah, don't know. But definitely, you know, asking, have you seen them? Have they been out? Have you heard anything? These kinds of things. And he says being able to call someone who's not the police to help. Yeah, exactly, because it's police that come for welfare checks. And realistic, like, so what will the police do in that situation? Or, like, I think we had a couple of people who wanted to go. Just
Feel free to unmute yourself.
GAF, did you want to go?
I also forgot to put my hand down, embarrassingly, but I think people are talking about being able to call the neighbors and how that would be, you know, ideal, and I think that kind of calls to the attention to that. In this kind of situation, it would be ideal if there were, like, if we weren't living in, like, you know, these places where you don't know your neighbors, where you don't trust your neighbors, where, you know, everyone has been, like, atomized, and you move house like or apartment like every few months to find somewhere cheap or for work or whatever. Because I think, like, one of the reasons it's so difficult to deal with the situations is because, you know, like, there's very, you know, proper communities are being, like, destroyed little by little, and it makes it so much hard. And and that's why it's really hard to deal with these kind of things, because you feel alone, and the only alternative that you think you have is calling the police.
And what will the police do? Like, so say this is a situation where you've not been able to get through to them. Maybe you have asked the neighbors and they've said they haven't heard anything, and they don't have any info, and they also don't have a spare key or anything. You banged on the door, and you're starting to get worried. This is when people would call the police. The police will just come and bang the door down, and then they will, like, have to call an ambulance if there's medical attention that's needed. Otherwise, they'll, I don't know, like, just cause some trouble probably. And if it's someone who's vulnerable, if it's a migrant, they might start asking for papers. If it's anyone that causes alarm bells in their heads, might end up criminalized in that situation. And so just to bang a door down, that's something that actually maybe we could get some help doing.
Or that they might get sectioned, which is incarceration in another name as well.
And the police also detain people under the Mental Capacity Act under Section 36 or whatever, if you resist. And so what are the tools that we might have if this is a situation where maybe someone has come to some harm? Like, do we have medical training in our communities? Do we feel like there's people around who could respond that aren't attached to the police? Do we have tools to pick a lock or to break a lock to get into a place? I feel like some people on this call probably do. A locksmith, when I've called locksmith, they never ask for any ID to prove that you actually live there also. So I don't know, someone who's just got like tools to be able to break in if you don't feel confident to do that, to do a welfare check that I feel, depending, like obviously it's not ideal, but if you're really concerned, and the thing that's actually standing in the, so I guess like the point with the scenario is to think about what are the actual obstacles and what is it that the police will actually do. Get to know your local squatters. They probably have got some skills in this. Another one. You're on the bus and you see someone talking to someone else and you overhear them say something overtly sexual and asking where they're going, and the person's looking very uncomfortable. Any thoughts on how we might respond? What's going on here? You want to unmute yourselves if you're an answer? Pretend to know the person who's being harassed. Pretending to be their friend can be a really good strategy. What does that do? What happens when you do that, and why that? We've attended bystander intervention workshops, so this should be a pretty easy one. We're running slightly over time. Are people okay to go for like 5 more minutes so you can wrap up? Sorry, I should have checked. Okay, thanks. Any other? So yeah, why pretend to be their friend? Like why? So what have you chosen to do there? Instead of just going and telling off the person who said this inappropriate thing.
I think it leaves quite a bit of agency in the person's hands. Like they can kind of pick up on the story and use it in a way that works for them. I also might somehow try to reference another person, like a third party, whether it's, I don't know, a brother or a cousin or somebody that we're going to meet, or so they just think there's as many people involved as possible.
Yeah, totally. So these kinds of ways to try and avoid the escalation that might happen if we directly intervene, I guess. And the dynamic that can be created by that that's a bit like saviory, you know, just coming storming in, being like, hey, that's not okay, is quite disempowering for someone who's already being disempowered. But doing these things that sort of give someone an opportunity to play along and to be like, hey, like I recognize your agency in this and that you need some support, and so you're my focus right now, is like a really powerful message in and of itself. And it can decrease that kind of escalation because you know, because someone's not being called out outright, they're just being disrupted and distracted, and it's actually just quite confusing when that happens, and it often just gives you a moment to disrupt that moment where that person was able to be intimidating or overpowering in some kind of way. And this kind of principle can be applied to like all kinds of situations when we really think about focusing on the survivor or the victim, or the target, and thinking about how we center their agency and their dignity, and just get creative, you know, like pretending to know someone does require a level of like creativity, you know, and there's other things that you can do, things that you can use around you, tapping into whatever, to think about ways that we can respond. Great, okay. Any sort of final thoughts or questions before we wrap up? Yeah. Sorry, we've gone a bit long. I'm still getting used to this online format stuff. Also wondering about creating some kind of diversion or distraction. Yeah. So you can ask for help with directions. You can get other people involved, being like, hey, have you seen what's going on over there? Should we go over as a group? And yeah, different kinds of things depending on the place. Like, so this was on a bus, but this happens, you know, on the street. It happens when you go to bars and clubs or whatever. When we do that again, yeah, you can do that thing where you show them a message on your phone. But yeah, it depends on the scenario, really, on what the circumstances. That kind of stuff does totally work though. Sometimes just literally sitting down next to them and disrupting and giving them someone else to speak to kind of just takes the power out of the other person who's been able to like focus all that energy on them. Yeah. So yeah, this has been a bit weird for me because I can't see anyone or whatever, so I don't really know how anyone feels about this workshop. But it's thank you for like having us, and thanks to TJ for tapping in last minute. Yeah, there's been a zine by Cradle that's called How to Be an Abolitionist Today, that's just like daily sort of like tips from like active listening to bystander intervention to a bit of de-escalation stuff to like how to do apologies, things like that are sort of like core parts of transformative justice and embodying this kind of these principles, with some stories from friends about how they've kind of done these things. So yeah, if you follow @Cradle Community on Instagram or any other social media stuff, you can order a zine in exchange for like a donation to a organization that's doing healing work and transformative justice work. Thanks TJ for sending the link. You can look at the post and see the stuff. I'm not really plugging the zine really, it's just more that I don't really know how to end this. Other stuff, Cape has a petition that is about trying to get the government to not spend all this money building more prisons in the wake of COVID. Like, probably should give that money to other more important, not horrific things. So there's a yeah, petition that's been shared by TJ there. It'd be great if you could share that, and just keep an eye out for more abolitionist stuff going on, because as has been pointed out, there's like a lot of momentum right now. We're just like figuring out how to safely and smartly go forward at the moment. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much, Kel and TJ, for doing the workshop. It's been really fucking great. We have touched on like so many different topics, and it's such a like big topic. So like, yeah, I would recommend everyone to actually check all of these resources and continue educating themselves. There's so much more we can talk about, and hopefully we'll do it in the future as well. So yeah, I'm just going to kind of like close things down by reminding people that this live stream will be posted later on online on YouTube. So if you want to revisit some of this the discussion, you can do it. Also, next week on Thursday, we have a reading group, or regular reading group, that is going to be talking about prison and police abolition. We have like some interesting resources and readings that we compile that people can check. So that's another way that people can motivate themselves to learn some of these things. And also, if you want to get involved with GAF, send us an email. And yeah, I think that's going to be it. I don't want to like everyone is everyone is a bit tired, but it has been really fucking great. So I think like people need a rest. So I don't want to take much more time. So yeah, thanks everyone. I hope to see you all soon. And set fire to the prisons, abolish the police, until we have a better world. See you all soon. Thanks so much.